Hi everyone, my name is Shalhevet Schwartz, and this is Gefet on Daf Yomi, a joint project of Hadran and Yeshivat Drisha. Today's Daf Kuftet Zayin, we will be dealing with the sugya that discusses the question of whether Noach was in fact a teiva, and it'll be an opportunity to both dip our toes into some of the halachic questions surrounding a teiva and its definition, as well as an opportunity to see a cool example of the rishonim offering a couple of very different explanations of really fundamentally what question the Gemara is asking, as well as then the ensuing Shachlavitaria, how it's best understood. But before we dive in, just a kind of a brief word on a teiva and what it is, a little bit of background. The Torah tells us not to eat neither nevelot nor treifot. Nevela is an animal that was something improper happened in the process of its shechita, right? It was shechted improperly, whereas a teiva is an animal that was considered to be sick or dying already before it was shechted. This, right, usually entails some kind of disease or death from natural causes, although an animal could also be a teiva because of something unnatural, like it, gets mauled by a lion, right? That's the literal meaning of the word teiva, like from taruf, toraf. And treifot and nevelot, right, also don't. Teiva is also not to be brought on the mizbeach. And as will become important a little bit later, treifot are not only defined as within the animal kingdom, but a human being can be a teiva as well, right? A ghosteis is defined as a teiva, someone who's dying. And that will have nafkamina both for questions about, right, in what cases are you responsible for murder? Someone's already basically dead. On the one hand, it'll also have ramifications for questions of gitin and kiddushin questions of gitin in particular. Right, in general, a married man goes off to Medinat Hayam. His wife can't get remarried because he's presumed to be alive unless we have evidence otherwise. Might be different if after a certain amount of time, if the person started out as a teiva, right, he might lose his chazaka of being alive. So those are just a couple of contexts in which the concept of a human teiva might come up in Chazal. And in terms of what does it mean for an animal to be halachically defined as sick such that it's considered to be a teiva, right? There are right, how quickly does it have to be it has to be dying. So how quickly would it have to die in order to be defined as a teiva? There are a couple of different positions: 30 days, a year, or potentially more than a year, a couple of years. And we'll see that's going to play out in how the rishonim read the sugya here. The sugya here is going to, through a discussion of what kinds of animals are allowed to go on a mizbeach in a sort of pre-Mishkan era, on Noach's mizbeach in particular, we're going to get to the question of, well, maybe Noach himself might have been a teiva. So with that, let's jump in. Our Gemara begins with Amar Mar Hakol Kashirim Lahakriv, right? This statement that one can sacrifice anything, obviously not anything, but anything's going to include behema, chaya, ve'uf, v'zecharim, v'nekevot, miminu, ba'alei mumim. Saw that a little bit earlier, and now the Gemara on the Midrash Halacha here that Rav Huna is going to do is going to go into each of those things. So minahani, where do we know that from? That Hakol Kashirim Lahakriv. Amar Rav Huna de Amar Kra vayiven Noach mizbeach ladunai vayikach mikol habehema hatehora mikol of hatahor. So Rav Huna brings the pasuk about, right, after Noach gets out of the teivah, he builds a mizbeach and brings korbanot from kol behema Torah v'chol of hatahor. So behema kemashmao, right, that one's easy. Behema we know. Chaya bichlal behema. Chaya goes under the umbrella of behema. And then zecharim unekevot miminu ba'alei mumim, right? How do we know that these animals can be zachar or nekeva, tamim or ba'al mum, right? They can either be male, female, or they can be fully in perfect shape, or they can have blemishes. De amar mar tamut v'zachrut b'vehema ve'im tamut v'zachrut be'ofot, right? The limitations that, right, we know about animals going on the mizbeach having to be tam or zachar are only limitations in when it comes to behema. There are no such limitations when it comes to birds, right? That's true for us, not literally us nowadays. We're not bringing any korbanot nowadays, but theoretically us. But when it comes to the pre-Mishkan era, Itakash behema le'of, right? There's this hekesh that we see from Noach's mizbeach between behema and of. So just as with ofot, also for us, those limitations don't apply. So too, for behema on that mizbeach, those limitations did not apply. All right, so we've got a more expansive category of what was able to go on the mizbeach back in the days of yore. Tamiminu ba'alei mumin, the Gemara continues, la'afuke mechusar aver. So sure, it's true that a baal mum is okay, but a mechusar aver, an animal that's entirely missing a limb, that's too far, right? That couldn't ever go on a mizbeach, delo. Amar Rabbi Elazar minayin mechusar aver shena asar livnei Noach. How do we know that even bnei Noach, or here Noach himself actually, that couldn't bring a mechusar aver? Talmud lomar mikol hachai mikol basar. We have this pasuk that says that Noach has to bring mikol hachai mikol basar. Amra Torah havei behema shechayin rashei ivarin shela. So the drasha on the word chai, right? Chai refers not just to the animal has to be alive, but even the rashei ivarim of the animal have to be alive. Wait a second, says the Gemara. The dilma l'maute treifa, right? Maybe mikol hachai mikol basar is coming not to exclude missing rashei ivarim, but coming to exclude treifa, right? That a treifa also could never go on a mizbeach. No, says the Gemara, hahu mi lechayot zera nafka. That we get from lechayot zera, where we have another pasuk that right, when Noach is bringing the animals onto the teivah, he's supposed to bring them so that they can continue to procreate. So we already know from that treifot would be excluded. Okay, but that only works, says the Gemara, hanicha leman de'amar treifa ina yoledet. That only works according to the position, and this is internal debate in the question of how we define treifot, that this only works according to the position that a treifa cannot procreate, right? If a treifa can't procreate, then the fact that Noach is trying to bring procreating animals onto the teivah excludes treifot. Okay, but elaman de amar treifa yoledet, but if you think that a treifa can procreate, ma'ikal meimar, then l'chayot zera doesn't help you. Sure, only procreating animals can go on the teivah, but some treifot are procreating animals. New answer, ha'amar kra itach b'domilach. So no, the pasuk says itach b'domilach, right? That the chayut zera itach, right? The pasuk, Noach is supposed to bring animals to that can procreate, and alongside you. But the drasha on that is that the itach right, means that you're only supposed to bring animals onto the ark that are like you. So that's how we know that it can't mean a treifa, right? It's not just an animal that can procreate, it's an animal that is like you in that it is not a treifa. Okay, here's where we get to Noach himself. The Dilma Noach gufe treifa hava. Well, maybe Noach himself was a treifa, in which case, bedomilach doesn't help you either. So the Gemara take first swing at rejecting that possibility. Tamim teivah. Wait a second. It says about Noach that he was pure and whole. So if he was pure and whole, it can't have been a treifa. All right, but that doesn't really work either. V'dilma tamim bidrachav. Right? Maybe the word tamim there isn't referring to the state of his health. Maybe it's just referring to his virtues. Tzaddik teivah. Well, it can't be referring to his virtues because we've got tzaddik also. Then that tells you that he's a virtuous person. No. V'dilma tamim bidrachav tzaddik b'ma'asav. So maybe both Tamim and Tzaddik are referring to his virtues, and specifically, Tamim is referring to his virtuousness, and Tamim is referring to his virtuousness, and Tzaddik is referring to his actions. But really, that whole pasuk is about his the state of his soul, and not about the state of his body. And really, maybe he was a treifa. So the Gemara's final solution is going to be Isa kadaitach Noach gufe treifa hava. Mika amar le'Noach dichbatach Yael shleimim lo ta'ayel. Right. Well, okay. If Noach was a treifa, then what would God have been saying to him when God said, "Bring itach hadomin lecha, bring the ones that are like you"? What? Noach's supposed to only bring treifot onto the teivah, and is not supposed to bring animals that are shleimim? That can't be. So, it must be that Noach wasn't a treifa, and that itach is coming to exclude treifot. That's the sugya. And the rishonim are gonna jump in with what ends up being an interesting question, even about the kind of havamina of the sugya, right? The question that the Gemara is asking: Dilma Noach gufe treifa hava, right? Maybe Noach himself was a treifa. But before we get there, sorry, we're gonna just quickly make some seder with the two possible right words that we're learning from them the isur of sacrificing a trefa in Noach's era. So option one is sort of this just lechayot zera, right? Only bring the procreating animals, but that only works if you think a trefa can't procreate. So then we have to go with option two, lachayot zera tach, right? Specifically, bring the animals that are like you, right? That if you think that a treifa can procreate, you get rid of a treifa by saying the animals that are like you. But what if Noach himself was a treifa? Well, that can't be because then what's the itach coming to teach? That Noach could only bring treifot? Okay, so it can't be that Noach was a treifa, and it can't be that Noach was allowed to bring treifot either. That's the sugya. Now we're actually going to get to the rishonim. Tosafot. V'im tomar behalo chai acharei kein shlosha me'ot shana. But wait a second. Didn't Noach live after the Mabul for another 3 years? Noach gets onto the Mabul at age 300 years, sorry. Noach gets onto the Mabul at age 600 and lives for another 300 years after. So wait, what kind of question is it? Dilma Noach Treifa Hava? How could he have been a Treifa? He lived for 300 years. I'm not going to live for another 300 years, and I don't think I'm a Treifa. V'yesh lomar, Tosafot's going to answer the question. Deshema lo haya b'koach u'priyut kara'ui lo, b'sugyan kamanda amar Treifa chaya. Okay. So maybe Noach was just not so healthy, and our sugya is according to the position that a treifa can live for a long time, right? Then an animal can be defined as a treifa despite the fact that it's going to be living for a long time, right? Just merely the fact that it's pretty sick, right? Even if it's a sickness that isn't terminal, that's enough to render it a treifa. That's sort of option number one. And Rabbeinu Tam offers a slightly different read. Rabbeinu Tam haya ragil lachalek ben treifot de'adam li'treifot debehema mishum de'adam itle mazala. So Rabbeinu Tam would draw a distinction between animal treifot and human treifot. Right? Animal treifot can't necessarily live for such a long time, right? Such a long time, right? An animal that's going to live for a long time is not a treifa. It's not dying. Whereas a human, right, a human who's sick and might live for a long time might be a treifa and yet might not die. Why? Because the adam itle mazala. So this will sort of depend on your mystical or superstitious inclinations. But what to understand what exactly Rabbeinu Tam means, but some form of luck or fate or supernatural protection that might come, and that might be a reason why a human being, despite the fact that they're very sick and even defined as dying, could actually continue to live for a long time. Ultimately, Tosafot is going to sort of reject the suggestion of Rabbeinu Tam. So Tosafot notices that actually there are comparisons made in the Gemara and Chulin already between a treifa de adam and a treifa de behema. So drawing that distinction, the way that Rabbeinu Tam wants to, might not necessarily work well, but that is at least Rabbeinu Tam's proposal. Tosafot in the parallel sugya and avodah zarah starts off at least on a totally different tack, proposes a totally different read of the sugya. Eventually it's going to reject it, but I think I want to focus a little bit on what the proposal actually is. So Tosafot says, even though Noach ended up living for a long time afterwards, right? Same basic question. How could Noach have been possibly a treifa? מכל מקום, באותה שעה, לא היה יודע אם היה טריפה או שלם, שיניח מלהביא טריפה מטעם דומים לך. The Gemara is not asking, when the Gemara asks, Dilma Noach gufe treifa hava, maybe Noach himself was a treifa, the Gemara is not asking, maybe Noach actually was a treifa, from our perspective. No, the Gemara is sort of asking a psychological or narrative question about Noach's self-perception. Noach, at 600 years old, a fairly crotchety old man, is heading into this teivah, and he's told to bring animals that are like him. So how is Noach supposed to know that that means not treifot, right? He might very well think that his time is short. And so, right, how could he know from domin lecha to exclude treifot? It's a totally different read of the question. It's almost like a psychological or narrative question. And then, right, ultimately, when the Gemara responds, well, what else would he tach mean? I guess Noach, right, if you have to bring something like you, and he's got these two options, either I'm a treifa or I'm kasher. It can't be that God's telling me to only bring treifot. So it must be actually that I'm bringing tamim animals, and maybe that means I'm tamim, right? On some level, Noach could discern something about the state of his health from God's command to bring only like animals onto the teiva. That's this other option. Ultimately, though, Tosafot doesn't like it. Tosafot's going to reject it. Why? Right? Doesn't make sense. This explanation. The al korchach lo his hero ela mitrefot hagalui v'nikar. The batrefot shebeseiter lo hayachol havchin. So, right, the problem doesn't even really get off the ground, because if Noah thought he might have been a treifa, well, there was no way that he was going to be prohibited from bringing animals that might have been a treifa, right? Clearly, God was, because how was Noah supposed to know what animals might be a treifa, right? A treifa should be safe there. Noah could only possibly discern when he's talking about bringing live animals onto the ark. Could only possibly discern about a treifa shebegalui, and those weren't like him anyway, because again, he didn't really know. So the challenge of Dilma Noach Gufe Treifa Hava doesn't work if what you think is Noach was unsure about the possibility of being a treifa. Rather, Ela Yesh Lomar, Tosafot's going to end up going in the same direction as Tosafot and our sugya went. Yesh Lomar Dehashta Kai Kamanda Amar Chaya, Dekasavar Treifa Chaya. Right, that actually this sugya is kind of goes according to the position that actually a treifa can live for a long time, and the fact that Noach then proceeded to live for a long time didn't to exclude the possibility that he might be a treifa. So, right, we do paskin this way. We paskin both the treifa yoledet and the position that Trey says treifa yoledet also thinks treifa chaya. So, it's actually okay to think that the Gemara was operating according to that assumption. All right, the Ritva is gonna present these two possibilities and in a slightly different way, or at least discern between them for slightly different reasons. But he's going to go in the same kind of basic direction. V'yesh mitarzin dehacha hachi ke'amar v'dilma be'ota sha'a savor hayanoach v'treifa hava. Right, the Ritva says that maybe right there are those who want to solve this Noach continued to live for a long time problem in more or less the same way that Tosafot just suggested. Maybe Dilma Noach Gufe Treifa Hava means maybe Noach, right, is a sort of internal to Noach's mind proposition. Noach thought, maybe I'm a treifa, and therefore how was he supposed to know not to bring treifa? Aval ein zanachol, right? This can't be true, says the Ritva. The imkein heichi mehadrinan tamim k'tiv bei. But how could the Gemara's answer? The Gemara's first answer was, right, oh no, he can't have been a treifa because tamim k'tiv bei, because the Torah says about him that he's tamim. The Ritva continues, Shaharei lo ne'amar bo be'ota sha'a tamim. Right? No one told Noach that he was tamim, so how would tamim k'tiv bei, the fact that the Torah calls him tamim, solve Noach's own psychological, right, Noach's own internal question of what kinds of animals am I supposed to bring on the ark? Ubimatan Torah hu dichtiv alei hachi. Right? It's at Matan Torah at Har Sinai we know that Noach was tamim, but Noach himself didn't know that he was a tamim. Right? This is right? The only thing that God said to Noach himself was, I've seen you as a tzaddik. We all know the famous Rashi that we learned in second grade, right? Right? The Torah describes in the third person, the narrator's voice describes Noach as a tzaddik tamim, but when God speaks to Noach himself, he only calls him a tzaddik. So the word tamim doesn't give Noach any information. The Ritva goes more or less in the same direction ultimately that Tosafot does. Maybe Noach actually was a treifa. Actually, he was a treifa, meaning actually he was imminently, like the state of his health was such that he imminently was going to die. But he managed to live for a long time after that because of a miracle. Right, so we know the miracles happened to Noach, so the fact that Noach then proceeded to live a really long life, despite being a treifa, right, that was just miraculous. So now to kind of look at the sugya through these two different lenses, and sort of how each one is understanding fundamentally what the question is, and what the kind of pieces that how the other pieces fit around that. Let's just summarize quickly. right? The option number one that ultimately the Ritva and Tosafot reject, right, is sort of the psychological explanation. The question, V'dilma Noach gufe treifa hava, if Noach thought that he might be a treifa, how could the pasuk teach him to exclude them? So ultimately, right, how are we reading basically the end of this figure, the maskana, that the fact that God commands Noach to bring like animals actually ended up right, making it clear to Noach that he was in fact healthy, right? God says, bring the animals that are like you. Noach's like, okay, what is like me? I don't know what I am. But I can't be a treifa, because if I were a treifa, God would be telling me to bring treifot onto the ark. So it must be that I'm healthy, and therefore I'm only supposed to bring healthy animals, even if Noach wasn't sure originally. And what's sort of gained by this approach is that you end up with not needing to distinguish at all between human and animal definitions of treifot, right? Either we can understand that a treifot really means that you're imminently dying, and we don't have to explain away Noach's particular case either. Whereas the second read, the read that everyone ultimately goes with, because textually I think it works a little bit better. Both Tosafot and the Ritva point this out, is that no, the Gemara is actually right, asking a real question. Maybe Noach actually was a treifa. And if Noach actually was a treifa, then right, how was the Chayot Itach supposed to tell him that he was specifically supposed to bring non-treifot? And then the end is that it wouldn't make sense for Noach to specifically bring treifot, and therefore we as the third parties can be certain that Noach was in fact not a treifa. But then you have to explain, right, how it was that Noach might actually have been a treifa, either because human treifot would have a different definition from animals, or because there was something particular or special to Noach's case. So just let's go through the shakla v'tarya of the sugya according to kind of each of these different reads. That first sentence, Dilma Noach gufe treifa hava. Maybe Noach was a treifa. So maybe Noach actually was a treifa, in which case, how could similar to you exclude treifot? Oh, tamim k'tivbe, we know that he must not have been a treifa, because it said about him that he was tamim. And then right, that gets rejected, and then we end up with the real answer, which is Isa kadaytach the Noach gufe treifa hava mika amar the Noach dechavatach ayah shleimim lo ta'ayah. Right, Noach can't be a treifa, because if Noach had actually been a treifa, then God would have been telling him to bring treifot on the ark, and that can't be. Must be that Noach was healthy. That's the read that everyone goes with, and then sort of the internal thought bubble read, right? Deal Noach gufe treifa hava. Maybe from Noach's perspective, right? How is he supposed to know that he wasn't a treifa? How could he see the word itach and know to bring only the healthy animals if he didn't know about what state he was in? Answer, tamim k'tiv be, right? He must have known that he wasn't a treifa because the Torah calls him tamim, but already the Ritva points out that line doesn't really work. And then ultimately the answer that the Gemara will actually land on, Isa kadaytach the Noach gufe treifa hava, right? If you were to think that Noach himself was a treifa, and here it's almost like, if Noach had thought maybe I'm a treifa, then what was God saying to him? Bring treifot. So it can't. So even in Noach's head, it can't be that I'm a treifa. Noach learns from the fact that God commands him to bring animals similar to him, and that couldn't have meant only treifot. He learns from that. Noach could deduce that he wasn't a treifa. So just a couple of little to tie up some loose ends. Let's go into a couple of the diukim between Tosafot and the Ritva, who both again propose the psychological approach and then reject it. There are still a couple of distinctions that I think are just important to get out in the open. So number one, right, why is it that the proposal that Noach didn't know, or the psychological proposal, why does that get rejected? So according to the Ritva, the Gemara's first answer doesn't make sense. Right? Noach was never actually told that he was tamim. So how could the Gemara propose that was how he understood that he was healthy, or that would help him understand what the Chayot Itach referred to? That wasn't information that he had. It's only information that we had. Whereas in Tosafot, it's even the Gemara's question that doesn't make sense. Right? It's clear that God couldn't have prohibited Noach from bringing hidden treifot, right? That there was no way that Noach was going to be able to do that. So then it wouldn't make a difference if he were one. right? The fact that he might have been a treifa doesn't actually, right? Like that wouldn't make the would it right would then not make a difference to the prohibition of don't bring treifot shebegalui. So just that's right. Difference number one. Difference number two. The question of really how could Noach have lived for 300 years as a treifa, right? According to the maskana of both Tosafot and the Ritva, that really there was a genuine possibility in the Gemara's mind that Noach actually was a treifa. How could he have lived for 300 years? According to Tosafot, right, the principle that a treifa can't live applies only to animals. But humans have mazal, and therefore a treifa can live for a really long time. Whereas according to the Ritva, no, Noach was actually dying. He was just dying for 300 years because of some kind of nis. So I think just to wrap up, I think what we saw here are two totally different angles as to how we understand this question that the Gemara asks of maybe Noach was a treifa. Are we reading this sugya as a question about the pasuk from our own perspective as readers, as sort of omniscient narrator readers, or are we trying to understand the story of Noach and the teivah from his internal kind of psychological perspective, and how is he understanding God's commands and prohibitions in light of the information that he has? And by the by, we sort of got to touch upon a couple of the different questions with regard to the definition and parameters of the treifa yoledet, treifa chaya. Are there distinctions between humans and animals? Thank you so much, and see you next week.